Welcome to the Love Tutoring Festival, day one, Monday the 24th of January at 3 p.m. And in this workshop, we will be looking at the area of young people, the interplay between young people, drugs, and the decision making that young people take in those key moments. I'm delighted, really delighted to be welcoming Fiona Spargo Mabbs, who is the director and founder of the Daniel Spargo Mabbs Foundation. This is Fiona's first time speaking at the Love Tutoring Festival, but she joined us for a Qualified Tutor podcast episode in 2021. So Fiona is, as a brief introduction, Fiona is the mother of Daniel, who died in 2014 from a lethal quantity of the drug MDMA. And Daniel Spargo Mabbs Foundation was set up that year to support and educate other young people and those around them to understand the dangers of drugs and alcohol. But today they do much more than that. They deliver workshops, they plan resources and curricula as part of the PSHE program nationwide. They train teachers and run the Youth Ambassador program to promote peer-to-peer learning and community amongst young people. And Fiona very proudly released her first book last year, I Wish I'd Known, the link for which we'll put in the chat very shortly, which is a publication that explores the risks posed by illegal drugs and explains the way the adolescent brain makes these kinds of decisions. And I'm sure a lot of the content in that book will be discussed today in the next hour or so. So once again, a huge thank you to our lead sponsors for the festival, Nudge Education, who've been with us so far every step of the way for the Love Tutoring Festival too, and to the day one sponsors, Remedy Tutors, part of the Remedy recruitment group, who are changing the lives of young people one step at a time, really. Very proud and glad for them to have joined us for Monday's activities. But Fiona has prepared a wonderful event for us today, so tune in and really enjoy the next hour or so. Fiona, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak. I've got some slides I'm going to share. I've got lots of things that I'd love to tell you, and I'm going to squeeze as much as I can into the time that I've got, and I've also planned in about 10 minutes at the end for some questions, so do put anything into the chat that pops into your head as we talk, or that you've already come along here with as something that you'd like to know more about. But this is me, as you know, as Luda's already explained. I'm the director and founder of the Daniel Spargo Mabbs Foundation, and I've been working in education for more than 20 years now, and I had been for obviously about 15 years by the time Dan died, mostly in adult education. I was an English teacher originally, and then primarily working with parents and with young children through family learning. So I guess this is what I knew to an extent, but we also knew that without really effective and evidence-based drug education, young people were facing decisions about drugs on an increasingly frequent basis without being well enough armed with the understanding of the decisions that they were making, and also the skills and resilience that they needed to understand what can make those decisions so complicated, especially in a social context and especially as adolescents. So this is very much things that I thought would be useful for you to know as educationalists and as tutors. And obviously you'll be working with a range of ages, and you'll be working with a range of young people, and sometimes I imagine probably short-term intensive bursts as well as over a longer period of time. So these will be differently relevant, but hopefully it'll be useful in terms of the context for the young people that you're working with. So we're going to look at what that context is, especially by the time they get to their teens. What are the kinds of things that the students that you're working with are going to be facing in terms of issues around drugs and alcohol? What are the risks? What's some of the underpinning knowledge that it would be useful for you as tutors to know? Understanding that decision making, and this may well be things that you're more than aware of already, but contextualized to drugs and alcohol. What's going on in that teenage brain that makes managing risk particularly hard, and some practical strategies that you may or may not be able to bring to conversations that you have with the students that you're tutoring, and where you and they can go for more information and support as well. And there's a little bit of there you are, there's Dan. And this is just some pictures of some of the things that we do, the work that we do with young people. Ludo's already explained some of it, and you can find out more on our website. Some of our amazing youth ambassadors. We've got lots of resources for teachers to use in schools. We do drug education workshops in schools. We do lots of stuff with parents, training for teachers and professionals. And we've got a play that we commissioned Mark Wheeler to write that's touring London schools at the moment. Actually, as a theatre and education production. It's been touring professionally since 2017. It was published by Methuen as well. So that's going to become a GCSE drama set text in September this year, which is amazing. So that's going to be everywhere. And Mark Wheeler is the most amazing playwright. It's going to be touring in Scotland as well. So that's all over the place. So those are some of the things that we do, and do have a look on our website and find out a little bit more. There you are, there's the play. But in terms of drugs and young people, the issues for young people are they've been growing really. And over the time that we've been doing this, as Ludo said, we started this charity in 2014 when Dan died. In 2018, this is the most recent government data. Government surveys 11 to 15-year-olds every 2 years. It's a year behind because of COVID, but the new data should come out this summer. But that found 16% of 11-year-olds have been offered illegal drugs, 9% have tried them. By the time you go to 15-year-olds, 59% of 15-year-olds had to make a decision about drugs, and that had gone up quite significantly over those previous 2 surveys, and 38% had tried something. So if the young people that you're working with, it's possible around 1 in 3 might, by the time they're 15, will have tried an illegal drug. And that's really gone up quite significantly, as you can see, over those years. In terms of those older teenagers, there's another survey that the government does every year, and that looks at 16 to 59-year-olds. Unsurprisingly, prevalence is highest in the 16 to 19s of those 16 to 59-year-olds. Cannabis is the most commonly used drug, probably not surprising to you at all either, followed by powder cocaine. Also not really surprising, full-time students, more likely than any other occupational group to have used drugs in the last year. And drugs at university, if you're tutoring sixth form students who are planning to go off to university, they will be coming across drugs at university, possibly to an extent and in kind of ways of being used that they may not have come across before. And drug use can become quite normalized for some groups at university. So again, it's something that's particularly relevant for that age group. And again, unsurprisingly, drug use higher amongst those reporting lower levels of well-being. That link between mental health and substance use has been around for years and years and years. In terms of young people who are needing treatment, who've developed issues with drugs or alcohol, most of them are there for cannabis. Just a bit of weed. I mean, it's a really, really difficult thing to come at, especially for teenagers, because they haven't always developed any kind of problems or problematic relationship that they're aware of by that age. But cannabis is the biggest reason for young people needing professional help. Most common vulnerability was starting early, so before the age of 15, and more than a third said that they got a mental health treatment need. And one of the growing issues is in terms of accessibility and normalization and just levels of exposure is the role that social media is playing. It's not really the role that social media is playing, but social media is a space in which drugs are being offered to young people more and more widely. It's a piece of work that I've been doing a lot around, meeting a couple of days. Actually, I'm chairing a national working group that's looking at specifically. But again, worth being aware, if you've got students who are on social media, which almost all of them will be, it's not unlikely that they will have seen drugs being offered on their mostly Snapchat, but also other things. In terms of who's at risk and the young people you're working with, the most obvious groups are ones that would come first to mind, really. Young people who are particularly vulnerable and who've probably got all sorts of other things going on in their lives that can make everything quite complicated for them. Exclusion from school is a big factor. I don't know whether any of you are tutoring people who young people who have been excluded from school or who are home learning for different reasons. But young people who are in contact with youth offending, again, are that bit more vulnerable. But actually, this is a nice guideline, the most recent nice guideline, and it broadens up really hugely, actually, as well, to young people who've got mental health problems, because that is a risk factor. The LGBTQ+ community across all age groups. Statistically, higher levels of drug and alcohol use, higher levels of mental health problems, all sorts of issues, to huge other subject, which is in my new book, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And just young people who are in places and spaces where drugs are being used, clubs, festivals, gigs, and young people who are around drugs, using drugs occasionally or recreationally. And actually there was some other data that came out just last year, which was really interesting, which looked at it from a kind of different angle again. It's the Millennium Cohort Study data, and this looked at young people who were then 17 and broke it down into different demographics, and found that boys are ahead of girls, not very far, but in cannabis, other drugs, binge drinking. Teens whose parents are graduates, more likely to have engaged in binge drinking than those who are not. And white teens, twice as likely as BAME teens to report using drugs other than cannabis. Cannabis is fairly universal. 3 times as likely to have engaged in binge drinking. So actually for those risky behaviours around drugs and alcohol, they might be exactly the kind of young people that you're working with. White middle-class boys are, in terms of risky behaviours, possibly not developing addiction, but in terms of taking quite significant risks with drugs and alcohol, they are the ones that should be on everybody's radar. Now, one of the things, it's an important starting point, and it's easy to forget. We do all know what drugs are and how they do what they do, but it's good to be reminded, and it's good for young people to be reminded. And basically, they're substances that mess with our heads, which is why people take stuff. But they do that by interfering with the way that our brain sends all those messages around itself all the time, all those neurons firing off neurotransmitters. It interferes with all of those systems in different ways, and the messages from different areas of the brain, and the different chemicals that are either stimulated or inhibited by that, things like dopamine, serotonin, and so on. It just changes the way our brain is functioning, which is why people take stuff to make them feel differently or perceive the reality around them differently. And that could be for positive or negative reasons, but that's what's going on and how they do what they do. In terms of what's around and about for young people, one of the things we do before we speak to 15 to 18-year-olds in schools, we ask lots and lots of questions so that we've got a sense of what the issues are, what's going to be most useful from the time that we've got with them. What do they see the issues as being? What do they feel they know already? What would their priorities be? This is our surveys from September, so we've got sort of 2,500 responses. What comes out as the substances, this is one of the questions we ask, what are the main substances used by people in your year group? And it's not confessions, it's just perceptions of use, what's around and about. So the percentage isn't numbers that are using, it's just numbers that are aware of this being something that is around. Alcohol is always top. Vaping is now always second. Used to hover between vaping, cigarettes and cannabis. Cigarettes and cannabis not that far behind. And then it can become very different actually between different schools now, especially with variation under COVID. We're not really post-COVID, are we? But it's really changed in terms of the variability between different schools. But overall, it's ketamine now that's number 5, closely followed by nitrous oxide, which was a clear 5th a couple of years ago. MDMA, cocaine, fairly much neck and neck. And then the hallucinogens, magic mushrooms, LSD, Xanax, which is a really strong anti-anxiety medication. It's a benzodiazepine, so similar to Valium or diazepam, something like that. And steroids, especially for teenage boys wanting to bulk up their muscles, that body image thing is something that can often be really overlooked, the pressure on boys to look a certain way. In terms of what they do, I'm going to race through this because I'm sure you'll be aware of it, but in terms of what's what and how they do what they don't do, stimulants, basically stuff like nicotine is biphasic, it can do both. MDMA, cocaine, steroids, study drugs, another thing to be aware of. Modafinil is the main substance that would be used for that, but they're stimulants again, used not uncommonly, I guess, at university, more widely maybe, but possibly, but also in sixth form, especially high achieving schools. Depressants slow everything down. Stimulants speed everything up, depressants slow everything down. Alcohol, cannabis and Xanax would all fall into that category. You've then got hallucinogens, which kind of just mess with our sensory perceptions, the way that our senses operate, and can affect the way that we're thinking and the way that we register reality and our consciousness. Obviously, LSD and magic mushrooms, you'll be aware of. A relatively new category that you may not be so aware of are two substances that are being used recreationally and have been for a long while, but are popular as these things go at the moment, are ketamine and nitrous oxide, and they're dissociatives. That they can't fall into that category because they're both anesthetics. So they stop things from hurting by blocking pain signals to the brain. So they basically block all sorts of other signals as well, which is why they can make people feel very kind of detached and disconnected, and kind of can have kind of out of body experiences, but a lot of numbness and so on. I'm going to try and stream a little bit of a video to you, but I can put the link in the chat if it for anyone that it doesn't work to as well, or I might not be able to actually, but I can send it out afterwards. But one of the things it's really important to, if you are able to have conversations with the young people you're talking to, but just to emphasize the random nature of illegal drugs. You just do not know what you're getting. As Ludo said, Dan died from an incredibly strong amount of MDMA. He got a little bag which was exactly the same as the four other boys that were with him, and four of them fine and Dan wasn't, because the little bag Dan had got MDMA that was 12 times stronger than had caused fatality in the past, it turned out. But there's absolutely no way that you can know by looking. And this is a clip from a Vice documentary which just shows a couple of lads in a bedroom in Brighton making ecstasy tablets, but it just shows the kind of messy, careless nature of the whole process.
We found two young entrepreneurs in Brighton who had no trouble using the dark web to sidestep Dutch competition and, in the true spirit of Brexit, bring pill production to the UK. You're using your tongue on the touch screen. Yeah. I've literally never seen anyone use an iPhone with their tongue as a finger. How does it taste? Random, yeah. So how'd you get this machine? Just credit card information I got from dark web to buy it. So you frauded it, basically? Yeah. I'm not going to tell you where from. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. How do you think the dark web has changed the drug industry in the UK? Crazy. You can now purchase drugs like you can purchase a fucking microwave. But it's not coming through international gangs and syndicates through Holland. No, we're basically the competition. So what are the things that go into a pill? MDMA, yeah, microcrystalline cellulose. I use like whoa. I use a premium mix. Alright, well, can you show me how it works? Yeah, man. So yeah, this is what, do you know what I mean? It's not, it doesn't come out of a fucking laboratory. People think it's clean and shit. And how much are you making in a batch usually? I know I stayed up one night, I did 1,600, the full Glastonbury. 5,000. Well, I think 5,000 over a week it took. So now we've got 11 grams in here in total, yeah, 3 grams in and fucking 8 grams of the binding agent, yeah. So just add a little bit of colour to that. So we get this in here. Whoa. Generally try not to spin it. Like that. That one nice, isn't it? Yeah, McDonald's. Is it a little bit like the craft beer revolution, where everyone wants like homemade, small scale? Stuff like that. Yeah, people are getting more for they want, I suppose. And I can put other things in, do you know what I mean? If someone wants me to put ketamine or fucking cocaine, I can put Xanax, I can put Valium, I can put absolutely anything I wanted
if something comes from Holland, we can copy that. It's things like PMA and other like additives that they definitely put in the speed and stuff as well.
So I mean, you can see from that, hopefully it wasn't too jerky to stream, but it's just so careless. And even if that end person, the dealer, whoever's handing it over, even if they are as responsible as can be, and obviously drug dealers don't want to sell off their kill off their customer base, they want to get a good reputation and so on. It's a long, messy process, and every time it passes through another pair of hands, obviously it's gonna, they need to make a profit. They're going to stretch it out somehow with a way of padding it out or putting something incredibly strong in so they can make it go further, but you end up with something that's really random. I just put this on this slide, I just changed it. I found this on the ground outside Farringdon station at 6 o'clock on Saturday, and it's got white powder in. It could be anything, probably cost someone 20 quid. I suspect it's cocaine, but I mean, it's absolutely no way that you could tell. And whatever it is, I mean, those are pills which look like lovely neat pills, but you saw what went in them. But pills, nitrous oxide, if it's been illegally supplied, whatever it is, cannabis, you can't possibly know exactly what's in it or how much, which are the two most important things, unless you can get that professionally tested. And that's a drug checking organisation called the Loop. There are a number of other organisations, not very many actually, but do similar things. And they've been doing back of house testing at festivals at clubs for a number of years. They've been doing front of house testing at festivals for the last few summers, because that's the only way that anybody, if anyone's got drugs and an intention to take them, the best thing that anyone can do to reduce the risk that they're taking is to let them know what's in that. And so the Loop have been able to test samples of people's drugs and to give them the results as part of a whole conversation involving lots of advice and information, and what would the risk actually, what does this actually mean? You know, what would the risk be if you were to take it? What about your drug use? What's going on there? But they find just a whole load of different stuff. So they put warnings out on their social media. Sometimes things that are incredibly, there's been such a lot of incredibly strong MDMA around for ages. Sometimes there's nothing of what somebody thinks it is. This was from September when festivals started up. There were a whole load of there was a shortage of supply in some areas of MDMA, and so there were all sorts of synthetic substances and caffeine that was appearing in MDMA pills. The strongest ever tested pills popped up in November. Maybe stronger ones, but these are the strongest that have been tested. And it's just that randomness. So bottom line with illegal drugs is that you've got something that's an unknown quantity. So in terms of managing risk, it's really tricky because you don't know what you're managing, but we'll come back to that. There are two substances that cause young people most problems, and I kind of gave you a bit of a clue at the beginning. If you're paying attention, you'll remember and note, and we'll probably be able to work it out for yourselves anyway. The two substances that cause young people most problems are alcohol and cannabis, and they're the two substances that they're most likely to take least seriously. Not all of them, of course, but many of them don't seem like a big deal, but they're the two. That's partly why they partly cause most problems, because they're most widely used, but they can harm adolescents in a way that they don't necessarily cause the same degree of harm to adults. And it's a really confusing time for cannabis. There are all sorts of messages around that can kind of undermine any sense for teenagers this is something that they need to take particularly seriously. You know, there's medicinal cannabis, so that must mean it's good for you, and there's increasing places around the world that are legalizing cannabis. So if something's legal, that must mean okay. And there are so many films and dramas now where you see people smoking cannabis, sometimes legally if it's in a US state where cannabis has been legalized, but sometimes it's just there. It's just kind of a bit of a trope now, old people smoking weed and falling out laughing, being really silly and stuff. But for teenagers, the cannabis that's on sale in the UK at the moment isn't safe and is causing harm. And they do need to be aware of this. It's not an easy message to communicate, but it is important. So cannabis basically affects a bit of your brain. It acts on the part of your brain we've got a natural endocannabinoid system, and it's a bit of our brain that is responsible for learning and memory, mood and motivation, appetite. So if your tutors are coming, your tutees are coming to you for however many hours a week, if they're also smoking weed, they're probably counteracting all the good work that you're doing, because it's not going to be helping their learning and memory, and that can stick around for a few days. And obviously the more anybody uses substances, the more kind of harder it is to kind of restore the kind of knock that it might give them. Two main chemicals, both of which I'm sure you'll have heard of. CBD is around all over the place. It doesn't cause a high, which is why it's not illegal, and you can get it in all sorts of products. The importance of it in cannabis, medicinally and recreationally, is its relationship with THC, because it can reduce some of the harmful effects of the THC, which is basically what makes cannabis illegal. That's the bit that causes the high, and can also cause anxiety, paranoia, panic attacks, all those kind of unwelcome effects of cannabis, if you like. The issue with cannabis in the UK now is it's just got stronger and stronger and stronger over the last 50 years. And it's the amount of THC has just gone up and up and up. Because of that, it's causing more and more young people to become addicted, develop a cannabis use disorder. The more regularly, the more frequently, and the stronger it is, the more likely they are to develop problems. They're also, young people particularly, because there's all this neuroplasticity in their brains, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Their brains are these amazing changing places. Any substances that they're putting in that are making changes to the way their brain is functioning are going to have a different kind of impact than they will to adults. And with cannabis, it's particularly around mental health. So young people, particularly who use cannabis, increase their risk of developing common mental health disorders, including anxiety and depression, 3 times. And sometimes young people are using cannabis in order to help them cope with their mental health problems, which is particularly sad when it's then ending up making things worse. They're also twice as likely to report psychotic experiences, and there is this really close connection with psychosis as well, which is constantly being examined. One thing it's worth being aware of is edibles as well, because they're quite I mean, popular is probably taking it too far, but they are around a lot more at the moment than they might have been even a year or so ago. Young people are really are ending up in hospital with these, and quite young teens as well. There've been a bunch of 12-year-olds not so long ago. And it's because they're processed by the body very differently. So if you smoke something, it goes into your lungs, pretty much goes straight to your head. Apologies for all science teachers on the call. It'll be a lot more kind of technically nuanced in that. But if you eat something, it goes in your stomach and it gets into your digestive system, and that takes a lot longer for the psychoactive effects to be felt. It takes a couple of hours, by which time it's too late to cut down what you've had. And especially if it tastes delicious as well. So young people are overdosing. Last quick word about, sorry, I'm trying to race through all of this because I want to allow time for questions. There's too many things to say. So apologies for talking so quickly and trying to jam lots in. Do remember to put some questions in the chat though. A quick word about law, because the legal risks and the consequences can stick around forever. Consequences of the legal risks can stick around. The legal risks aren't always taken as serious as they need to be either. So obviously lots of different, well, there are basically 5 different offences, including, or 6 if you include possession with intent to supply, and different classifications which relate to sentencing guidance. The biggest risk for young people is what's referred to as social supply, which is basically the person who gets the drugs in for the group. So they're not making a profit, they're not a dealer, they're not in the business, but it's how it almost always works for young people, is that someone will get them in and share them out. They'll pool their money. It's exactly how it happened with Dan, how it happens with time. 59% of 11 to 15-year-olds who had used drugs had got them from a friend, but that's a criminal offence in the eyes of the law. As soon as drugs pass from one pair of hands to the other, most young people don't know that. Most adults don't know that, to be honest, but teenagers are constantly being arrested and charged with supplying drugs. It particularly reaches the headlines when that teenager dies. Carson was only 13, and another boy who was then 14 was arrested, and he was sentenced when he was 15 for supplying drugs that killed his friend. And then, of course, there are all the other offences relating to the way it affects your coordination, balance, judgment, and behaviour. Consent gets really blurry. when drugs and alcohol are involved on either side of that transaction. Foreign holidays, a lot of countries that are quite popular holiday destinations or gap year destinations have got really punitive drug policies and laws. And then there are kind of local policies, school, university, workplace. There were just over 12,000 young people in the last reported year, which is a couple of years back now. Of course, COVID will have changed all of that anyway, but excluded for drugs and alcohol. And of course, that can have a massive impact on future opportunities. But having a criminal record, that's so far-reaching and sticks with you forever. You've got to put it on your UCAS form. There are jobs you'll never get if you've got to have a DBS clearance or other jobs as well, and countries will never give you a visa. You'll never get to go to America. That's the thing that sometimes swings it for young people. Okay, quick look at decision making. And there is always a reason, and I guess, I mean, this is something I emphasize particularly for parents, but also for young people, is that there is going to be a reason why you're doing this. It's just, you might not be aware of what it is, but the more you can be self-conscious about that decision you're making, especially when there's risk involved, and with drugs and alcohol, there's always risk, the more kind of in control of that you can become. In terms of why young people might take drugs, this again is from the government data for 11 to 15-year-olds. The biggest reason, this is on the first occasion, the biggest reason across all those age groups was curiosity, that experimentation, that curiosity that we encourage in children because it's how we learn, but it can creep into all sorts of other things as well. But kids are curious, and if drugs are around and they're exposed to stuff, it's not to be unexpected that that's one of the things they might be curious about. For the effect of it, apart from the younger ones, that's the next biggest reason, and it's important to keep in mind people take drugs to make them feel good. You know, that there are positive, there are welcome effects that people are looking for. They don't ask about peer pressure, but they do ask about because my friends were doing it. So that kind of joining in and maybe going along with something. Boredom is more for the younger ones. But I wanted to forget my problems is something really to keep in mind, and I know I've mentioned it already, but even for those 12-year-olds, 1 in 5 said that they'd taken drugs on the first occasion. And this isn't alcohol, cigarettes, vaping, this is illegal drugs, controlled substances. 1 in 5 had taken them to forget their problems, which is a concern. There are different types of drug use, obviously, but again, important to keep in mind. For young people, mostly it will begin and end. If it begins at all, it'll begin and end there. It'll be something that they dip a toe into. They might stay there a little while, but they'll come out together and move on. That can become more regular, and maybe because of that friendship group, it's what they do. Can still be functioning, but maybe things will start to fall away. They might stop being so bothered about stuff that they used to, and their general functioning might start to go down. If that then develops into addiction, this is not an inevitable path, but it can, for some young people, lead to addiction, and that then becomes the focus. Your brain literally wires itself around needing that substance. At that point, they probably won't be coming for tuition anymore, but then if you're working with vulnerable young people, you might still be seeing them. And it just becomes very difficult for them to stop, not impossible at all, but they will almost always need professional help to kind of unravel that. And there is this chicken and egg relationship with mental health disorders. This is World Health Organization statement or quote anyway, many risk-taking behaviours, lots and lots of risk-taking behaviours start in adolescence. There are reasons for that we'll look at, and they can be a way of coping with poor mental health, but they can also really significantly impact young people's mental health. And it can be this cyclical thing, but it's something that's really worth being mindful of. And in terms of a coping strategy for young people, it's a really, really bad one. And of course, trauma can play a really significant role in addiction for young people and for adults. What makes it difficult in terms of decision making is all these changes that are going on in their brain, and their brain is going through this really critical period of change, and it lasts a long time, from 10 to 25, and its brain is kind of going through a rewiring process, and it doesn't finish until they're in their mid-20s, and it starts around about puberty when they're about 10. And there's what's sometimes referred to as a developmental mismatch, because the different areas of the brain that do different things develop they don't all kind of develop in one go. There are different bits that develop ahead and other bits later. So the feeling and reacting brain, your limbic system, and your thinking brain, your prefrontal cortex, they're two parts of the brain that are particularly at play when we're making decisions. And your limbic system, that place where all those social and emotional variables happen, that's really, really well developed in adolescence. It develops really early, and it's really kind of overdeveloped in a way. It's very hypersensitive. There's an increased release of and sensitivity to dopamine, which is our natural happy high. And in the structure of our brains, risk and reward are really closely linked, which is where kind of that buzz that you can get from taking a risk can happen particularly intensely in adolescence, and the reward that we'll get from that. The prefrontal cortex, which is all our executive functions, that doesn't connect up properly until we're in our mid-20s. And so for teenagers, all these things can be that much harder, thinking things through, planning, organising, acting with consequences in mind. It's also the bit of our brain that kind of helps us manage our limbic system. So self-regulation, moderating our impulses, all that acting in the moment stuff, and social interactions. That's why that can be so incredibly socially self-conscious in our adolescence. And there's also then the role of peers and peer influence, as you will no doubt remember from your own adolescence, and I'm sure we'll see in the young people that you're working with all the time, is huge. Some of that is just a natural developmental need to become independent adults. And so there's this shifting relationship with their parents or carers, and their friends become increasingly important as part of that. They kind of need to know, they need to shift from knowing that they're safe in a family unit to knowing that they're safe outside their family unit with their peers. Spending more time together as they get more independent, so inevitably influencing each other more. And there's all this hypersensitivity going on because of the stuff with their limbic system, their prefrontal cortex. And interestingly, in studies that have been done, because adolescents statistically do take more risks than adults. And when studies have been done, they're often around kind of taking risks, and there's quite a famous one that was in a driving simulator where you had to get to a goal, but there were risks you could take along the way and you'd get rewards for taking risks. Teenagers left to their own devices, on average, their accident rate was about the same as adults. But the big difference with adults was as soon as teenagers were able to bring their friends along with them, their accident rate really went up. And that's really useful for adolescents to be aware of. They've got this heightened sensitivity to social reward and social exclusion. It's going to take them longer to think things through. It's harder to manage impulses and responses in that moment. They're much more likely to take risks when they're with their friends than when they're on their own. And in studies that have been done around the world, in global studies, risk-taking peaks between 13 and 16. So if you're working with 13 to 16-year-olds, managing risk is going to be just that bit harder for them, and they just need that bit of extra help. So in terms of conversations and what you may or may not be able to bring to these, they can start really early. You saw how many, we may not remember because I've whizzed through all of this, but it was 16% of 11-year-olds said they'd been offered illegal drugs. And young people will be aware of stuff just from seeing things on various sorts of media. It's also never too late. You know, if nobody's had that conversation with that young person, they haven't got a clue. Don't feel in order to have that conversation you've got to be any kind of an expert, but do keep your knowledge as up to date as you can. We've got so much stuff on our website. You can follow us on social media. I'm always putting various bits of news and relevant stuff out there. You can take and make opportunities for conversations, especially if you've got a little bit of a radar for a young person. There might be something that's come up in the news, or there might be something that you've sort of seen on a program that you know they watch as well. And if they talk to you, I mean, I know that you will know this, and I know that you've got your tutoring to do as well, but it's so important to listen. I'm doing a load of focus groups for my second book at the moment, which is another book for parents and teenagers, but I'm doing lots and lots and lots of focus groups with teenagers, and what they say above everything else for parents is, please just listen. Let me finish what I'm saying. Listen properly. And in that listening, it's easy with drugs to kind of panic and jump to conclusions. But try very hard not to. That's where the listening comes in. Really important to emphasize social norms around drugs and alcohol. Most young people aren't taking drugs or drinking to excess. Repetition and reinforcement, it's difficult for those messages to stick sometimes, but also really important in your role. And this is where Luda and Julie will be able to advise you as part of the qualified tutor thing. But those safeguarding boundaries, at what point do you need to be talking to parents or passing something on? In terms of some headline advice around conversations about managing peer influence, thinking ahead, planning a reason. We're programmed as human beings to respect a reason. If you've got a reason ahead, even if it's not very good, if you stick to your guns, then you can get through a lot of situations. But they might want to prepare an excuse to get out for that moment of decision, so they're not caught on the back foot. Sometimes it's best just to avoid pressured situations or groups. Can they buy themselves some time? Can they use some stalling tactics to access that prefrontal cortex, give themselves a chance to think through what the consequences and impact might be? A really useful question to keep in their head is, would I make the same decision if I was on my own? If they know they'll take more risks when they're with their friends. And also really important to remember that your friend, generally speaking, friends don't matter, and especially good friends. It's easier said than done when you're a teenager, or believed as a teenager. But if you made different decisions, would they really mind that much? And also, it's always okay to say no. And it's also really important to remember how powerful that peer influence can be for the good as well as ill. And if one person in a group is feeling uncomfortable, chances are one of their friends is too. But it takes one person to kind of have the confidence and courage to step out and say, actually, I don't really want to do this. We talk to young people about the frog in the boiling water. And if you've got a frog, you put it in a pan of boiling water, it'll jump straight out. But you've got a frog, you put it in a pan of cold water, bring it slowly to the boil. And it doesn't really realise, and it can be so like that with friendship groups, you know, it's those subtle changes around you where something kind of gradually becomes normal that was never normal, or becomes okay that was never okay. And you can cross little lines without even realising that you have, and get somewhere you'd never have jumped into. A few really practical things you can do with a phone. They can set up their in case of emergency details. You can do that on any phone, and it just means if their screen locks on, whoever loves them best in the world, someone can contact them straight away. And that's just, anyone can do that for anything. You can do that. It's a really useful thing to do. Another thing they can do that's a really good tip is to hatch an escape plan. And they can do this with their parents or responsible older sibling, someone that's reliable and won't be there. And all they need is a code. It could be anything. It could be an emoji, it could be an X, it could be anything, as long as they both know what that is. Generally, the other person will then just call. They can have planned ahead what their excuse might be. It could be, that was my dad, he's locked himself out, I'm really sorry, I've got to get home. If it's their parents, they have to promise that they're not going to ask any questions. So if they're talking to their parents about this, they have to make them promise that, which will be really hard. But if they know they're going to get a big hard time, then they're not likely to trigger that. Lastly, download the St John Ambulance First Aid app. If they're in a situation where something's going wrong for someone they're with, it's really easy to panic, but that gives you so much useful advice. Quick bit, you will know this about alcohol, and I'm really conscious of the time, I want to give you time for questions, but just make sure if you're talking about alcohol that they know what a unit looks like, because if it's vodka, it's hardly anything, and all the other stuff you'll know about, sipping and taking things slowly, and increasing numbers of young people that aren't now drinking at all, around 1 in 3. Really quick headline harm reduction stuff. If someone talks to you about going, especially if they're talking about going to a festival in the summer, it may be that you can have a conversation, kind of really generic harm reduction stuff around drugs, because they've then got that in their own back pocket. The only way you can make drug related risk zero is not to use drugs, but realistically, if someone is, there are things they can reduce that risk. It's really important they know stuff, especially including harm reduction information and about specific substances as well. Stick together, really got to have a clear head around anyone that's using drugs or drinking heavily. Really important that person checks in with them regularly. Really important not to mix stuff. It changes the effects and changes the risk, especially with alcohol, actually, but other things as well. All the harm reduction advice around drugs is start low, go slow. You don't know what's in it. You don't know how strong it is. You don't know how it's going to affect any individual at that time and place. Don't jump in with a whole pill or a whole bag of powder. You're testing it on yourselves as well as self-medicating. Lots of factors can affect risk that can be variable. Those legal consequences, food and water is different for different substances. If you're in a bad place in your head, drugs are likely to make that worse. And really important to emphasise not to be afraid to call 999. A lot of young people worry about getting in trouble or getting someone else in trouble, but they could literally save somebody's life. And the trouble, if there is any, will not be as bad as something going wrong. these are all useful places to go for more information and advice about drugs, and these about alcohol. They are all on our website, so do have a look there if you want to find out more. Those have got all sorts of information for young people. Young Minds and Hopeline UK, Young Minds particularly, all sorts of mental health stuff. Hopeline UK is a suicide helpline for teenagers, really useful for people to have on their phone. And these are all our socials, and our website's got lots of stuff, and that's my book, which Jack was very kindly flashing in the air. But there's loads and loads of that in that. It's lots of story. It's kind of part memoir, part more, hopefully really, really useful handbook for parents, but also for anybody working with young people. But actually I've written some short ebooks that should be coming out next month, to accompany that. So one set is for schools, colleges, another is for around neurodiversity, another is for parents of faith and faith leaders. And as I mentioned, I'm just writing another book for parents, which is called Talking the Tough Stuff with Teens, and that will be, if I manage to make my writing deadline, which is the middle of June, that should be out at the end of the year. But that's around all those really difficult conversations. Again, it's for parents, but hopefully it'll be useful for anyone working with young people. And I'm really sorry, I've got 4 minutes left for questions. Sorry, Ludo, I talk too much.
Not at all. Don't you dare apologise, Fiona.
I talk very quickly to try and squeeze it all in as well. Sorry, so I've probably just overwhelmed everybody.
No, I don't think so at all. There were some questions in the chat. Thank you so much, Fiona, for that. If anyone would like to take themselves off mute to ask a question, then please do feel free. But I think Ethan asked earlier on, Fiona, perhaps there was a little bit of insight you could provide here about the use of drugs during the pandemic and whether there's any data to show whether that's increased or decreased, or perhaps it's too early for that kind of data.
There have been various studies that have come out that have looked at it in different ways. On the whole, as a huge kind of generalization, it's similar with alcohol. So with alcohol, people that were already drinking fairly heavily tended to drink more. People that weren't drinking very much stopped altogether or drank less, and most people were somewhere in the middle. But it was similar with drugs. So people that were already using drugs maybe more heavily than kind of occasionally and recreationally would tend to use more. But the kinds of drugs people were using unsurprisingly changed. So drugs like something like MDMA or ecstasy, which is a really social drug, that where there weren't parties and gigs and festivals and clubs and stuff, that use of that really went down. Cocaine was still being used, but less so. It was stuff like benzodiazepine, cannabis use rose quite a lot for some people, but the nature of drugs changed as well. Hence there was this shortage of MDMA and other synthetics coming around. So it kind of remains to be seen really what the impact's been, but it seems to be similar to alcohol in the sense that it's had the heaviest hit on people that were already using drugs, and also the motivation for using drugs. So especially where university students were surveyed, there was a lot of people that were saying, I'm using drugs because I'm just bored, you know, I don't know what to do, I've got all this time, I'm just stuck in my room, I can't go anywhere. And other people that were using it to cope with mental health and just to cope with how hard life was under the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting insights about the patterns between those who were regular drinkers anyway, and how that affect, you know, it's not just a kind of there were more drinkers or there were fewer drinkers. So yeah, thank you, Fiona. Any other questions that you guys have about Fiona's presentation there, or about the book, or about the play? Indeed,
it was a play as well.
If there are other questions, Fiona, I'd love to hear more about the play, because the book is one thing, the work you do is another thing, but the play is a wholly separate entity that people can engage with.
Yes, well, actually, Jack there knows Mark Wheeler very well, because you've known Mark for years and years, haven't you, Jack? So, and in fact, I've just written a book with Jack and with Mark, and Mark is writing a musical with Jack about drugs, interestingly. Yeah, which may or may not get anywhere. So the play, it's a verbatim play. Mark Wheeler is this incredible playwright. He's been writing play since the 80s, and particularly for teenagers. He was a drama teacher. He's now retired and full-time playwright, but only recently retired. But a lot of his plays are verbatim plays, which means all the words in the play are the actual words of the people in the story. So all the words in this play are the words of Dan's family and friends. So he came up to Croydon, South London, where we live, from Southampton, where he lives, and did a whole load of interviews just months after Dan died. Actually, it's incredibly early, so it was all very, very raw, and there were lots of things we didn't know. There were things we found out through the writing of the play, and it became this incredible, beautiful play that's really sad, but it's also got lots of that's in it about forgiveness and hope and love and friendship, and as I think I said at the beginning, it was published by Bloomsbury. It's on their Methuen and Plays for Young People in Schools list, so it's been used all over. I mean, literally today I was just emailing a sixth former in a school who's doing a production, who wanted to make contact and find out if they'd be able to chat to anyone about the play. Most of the time we don't know where that's going on, but I know it's been all around the world. Just before COVID hit, there was a school in Canada that I did a Skype with. It was just they weren't able then, they were kind of nearly hoping to be able to do the performance, and then things shut down just before they were able to do it. But there was another school in New Zealand, there was a youth theatre in Australia, so that was just in the last couple of years before everything kind of stopped. But it's amazing that it's going to be a GCSE drama set text, and we commissioned Mark to adapt it to tour, so it became a shorter play. It's a 2-act play in its published form, which is the best form, but it's a shorter play, and it's a 4-hander, so it can be it's a multi-role play anyway, in the sense that there isn't a character for, anyway, it's another story, there isn't a character for Dan. People kind of multi-role character of Dan, but the touring production's got 4 actors, and that has been touring since 2017. We obviously weren't able to tour it last year, but what we did under COVID is just touring. It's just started it's in week 2 now of a 10-week tour at London schools. We've got a tour in Scotland, Edinburgh, Glasgow and Dundee, starting after half term. And hopefully we'll have a few performances in Oldham as well. We've been given some funding to work in schools there. It's a performance of the play, and then a theatre and education workshop. So it's a really introductory drug education workshop there. But it just has such an incredible impact. I think drama just has a way of, I mean, maybe this is me as an English teacher or something, but I think it's kind of like poetry is to prose. No offense to prose at all, because I love prose too, but poetry kind of engages your imagination in a way that prose can too, sorry, but you can say such a lot in one word in poetry, and in drama I don't know, there's something that it just can communicate in a very different way than anything else, and it does that, and particularly for young people. And I think particularly what young people say is it's a true story, and particularly that it's real words. And of course most of the words are words of 16-year-olds, because they're all Dan's friends, and Dan's girlfriend Jenna, who was just 15. So it's just such an incredibly powerful thing, and we're so grateful to Mark. He was amazing.
Well, that's your next step then. Your next step is to go and check out Fiona's book, to go and check out the play, and to see if that's on anywhere near you.
Yes, well, there will actually, sorry, in the autumn, the theatre company that's got the production running in Scotland, they're planning a tour of national tour of professional theatres. So it'll be the full 2-act play, and it will be in proper, it won't be in a school hall. I mean, school product performances are closed to the school audiences. Generally, sometimes we can do community performances, but it's tricky with COVID. But that will be open to anybody. So there will definitely be putting information out about that. So if anyone's interested in finding out more or coming along, look on our website.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Fiona. That was a really very powerful, moving, and as ever incredibly informative workshop there. Please do reach out to Fiona via the links she provided in the end of that presentation, and make contact and see where Fiona and her team can help you, and where you can help Fiona and her team. I'm sure as well there's that opportunity for learning both ways. Now, just before we move into, we've got 2 events coming up in the next 10 minutes or so, which is scarcely believable, I hear you say. But the first is the raffle draw, which will, I can see Charlotte Watson preparing her feather boa and her little, is that a tiara? I think that's a tiara, headband. The raffle draw will be taking place in just a second, delivered by Jack and by Charlotte, and then straight after that will be the start of the discovery rooms, the partner discovery rooms, where we'll be opening up breakout rooms for you to chat to and get to know the different partners that we have here. But just before we finish Fiona's event here, I'd like to just show a little video advert of one of our general partner sponsors, which is Agnes O'Brien's 11+ ISEB SATS GCSE and A-level resource group, which deals very much with parents and with tutors. So an interesting link there with Fiona's Fiona's event. So for one final time, thank you very, very much, Fiona, again, and please enjoy this short video. Okay, so that is the little video from, as I said, from Agnes's group. As you see there, members of that group are able to access the qualified tutor training programs with a 20% discount. So do join in there. I'll put the link for that group in the chat in just a second, as will I'll also pop in the link for the qualified tutor training page, so that you can sign up from our next cohort, which starts this coming Monday, so that you leave only a weekend's gap between the end of the Love Tutoring Festival and the start of your next QT training.